Welcome to De-Risky Business, the economic security podcast from the Center for a New American Security in Washington, D.C. I'm your co-host, Emily Kilcrease.
And I'm your other co-host, Geoff Gertz. This episode is the first in a three-part mini-series on economic security issues in Asia we'll be running over the coming weeks. Today we're talking with Dan Rosen, head of the Rhodium Group's China practice, about the recently concluded third plenum meetings in China.
Dan helps us out with hard questions like, what is a plenum? Why does the third one matter? And what did we learn about how China is managing its economic downturn and the impacts for the United States?
As you'll hear from Dan, unfortunately it's mostly some bad news, but we hope you enjoyed the conversation anyways, as we certainly did. And you'll join us for the next two episodes to hear more on Asia and economic security.
Welcome to De-Risky Business. We're joined today by Dan Rosen, the co-founder of the Rhodium Group, an independent research firm that provides some of the best analysis on China's economy. Dan leads Rhodium's work on China, has researched and written widely on China's domestic economy and its role in global trade, and has served in high-level government economic roles, including on the White House Economic Council and the National Security Council. Dan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great, Dan. So let's jump in. We want to start with a question we ask all of our guests, which is, how do you define economic security? I think Emily and I sometimes joke a little bit that everybody agrees economic security is national security, but nobody actually agrees on the definition of economic security. So what does economic security mean to you?
Yeah, and I don't know if everybody agrees on the definition of national security either. So
That too.
we're on shifting sands here. And I guess my trick answer would be that I don't really define it. I'm trying to keep my mind open right now and look at the question from different angles to make sure I don't get stuck on a single one that ends up being unhelpful to me. There's some principles we can probably agree on, right? That our national interest is crucially dependent on the economic dynamism that sets the United States apart from, all the other liberal market democracies, really, in terms of its resilience and prosperity over the decades now, let alone other systems such as China's system that we're going to be talking about. And so we know that whatever we think economic security is, it has to be compatible with our efficiency and dynamism as a civil economy. And we also know that the trend is very much in the direction of more state increasing the balance of state intervention in the economy, as opposed to going in the more liberal direction that we did after the Cold War. And so there's a lot to be thinking about here. I think it's crucial that we don't come down too concretely on one simple bumper sticker on what it means. The work you guys are doing are important to that. And, I think a really robust conversation among the tribes between security-minded folks and economic-minded folks is the key to getting to the right place in terms of how we define and operationalize that term.
Great. Well, Dan, we wanted to talk to you this week because last week, the week of July 15th, there was a fairly significant event in China's political and economic calendar. This was the third plenum meeting, which many China watchers were looking at to see if there were going to be any important signals coming out about how China intended to manage its economic downturn. But let's start with the basics. Like, what is a plenum? Why do we care about the third plenum? How does this fit into the political calendar overall? And why were China watchers so interested in this particular meeting?
Yeah. Great question. A good place to start. In a communist political system, you have a party Congress, which ostensibly represents all the interests of everybody in society, the people, etc. And then that Congress and its elected central committee of a Politburo and a standing committee of that central committee, which is where you find the topmost leaders in the system, do all sorts of work, each in their own domains and areas, and then come together for plenary meetings or plenums on a generally regular cadence over the course of that Congress. And the Congress is in China defined in 5-year cycles. And so usually right after a new standing committee is elected, central committees and standing committee are elected. A first plenum takes place immediately and it makes organizational decisions. You could think of the same way that whenever a new administration comes in, one of the first things that it does is it gives itself a national security memorandum from the president that defines who will be on the National Security Council, right? Which is at the discretion of the president, right? And is not controlled by statute or anything like that. And so the party kind of does its own defining as it goes along. The third plenum, out of I think there are 7, although you'll have to get a political scientist on to be super certain. But I do know the third is the one that conventionally is meant to address any big economic business. It's not meant to make short-term decisions about the economy. It's not where an interest rate cut is supposed to be discussed. It is where the big doctrinal, systemic questions about the way the economy works are supposed to be addressed. Ordinarily, that will happen in the fall following the commencement of each new Congress, which would have meant last fall we expected to see the third plenary meeting of the 20th Party Congress of the modern, of the People's Republic of China. We did not. It's 9 months later, and as you said, July 15, 2024, it happened. So they are the Communist Party, and they will decide what communism means and how communism will behave. They, without explaining or feeling compelled to give some reason for it, just popped up a couple months ago and said, we're going to do it in July, 9 months after you expected it. And so we finally got to it. Generally lasts 3 days, concludes with a kind of immediate communique and press release. And then a couple days later, traditionally, and that did happen this time as well, a longer document referred to as the resolutions or decisions document is released that has the big reveal of whatever they cooked up in each of these cycles. It was, and then we can dig into this one in just a second, but just as a reference point, when we talk about the sort of reform era in China, and you could say that from 1949 we had China before reform, during of course all through the Mao era through 1978, very end of 1978. It was a third plenum meeting of I think the 11th Party Congress, 1978, that fired the starting gun on what came to be called the reform and opening era. So these third plenums have at times been immensely important in marking a change of phase, a sea change that gave us a lot to think about and look closely at to see what it would mean for the period to follow.
So we will unpack what came out of this particular plenum that concluded. But first, maybe let's give a little bit of context for the listeners in terms of the challenges that China was facing as it was heading into this important set of meetings. And, perhaps worth noting, you mentioned the 1978 plenum, which was a milestone event in terms of like marking the reform and opening era. 2013 was also an important milestone event. That was Xi's first third plenum, and there was some signaling, unrealized over time, but signaling around deepening of reform. And I wanted to quote for you some of your own work in terms of kind of where we've come since 2013. So in a recent Rhodium, and it's worth quoting at length because I think it does set the scene well, but in a recent Rhodium note, you and your colleagues wrote that Beijing's challenges are monumental, both in presentation and substance of reforms. The fundamentals of China's economy are not nearly as healthy as in 2013. The population is declining, the retirement age is unchanged, so the labor force is shrinking quickly, the property bubble has burst, local government debt is crippling fiscal policy, extensive crackdowns against private sector firms have weakened business confidence. The rest of the world is increasingly alarmed that China's manufacturing-led growth strategy will require far more aggressive trade defenses, as there are limited signs China's domestic demand is expanding to reduce trade imbalances. So that seems like an awful lot of bad news layered on top of more bad news as they're heading into this set of meetings. Like, is that too pessimistic, or is that basically kind of where Rhodium is thinking China's economy is right now in terms of its overall structural health?
Yeah, I don't think there's any way to avoid that list of diagnoses on the state of things. Uh, it's not just a Rhodium group evaluation that uh, points to the extraordinary downdrift in investment because of the property sector collapse. This was by far the biggest sector of activity in the entire economy, and it has shrunk in annual value by 70%, just about. In just a few years' time, what took Japan 15 years to do after its real estate bubble popped in the 90s, China did in about 2.5 years, wrenching, impact on overall economic activity. Um, Household consumption after COVID was expected to bounce back and be quite strong, and instead, all available indicators, point to Chinese households being quite anxious, not spending as much as expected, saving a lot in anticipation of unfunded needs for healthcare, education, maybe losing jobs in the family, who knows, whatever. So the evidence is really very abundant about the magnitude of the problems. Now, we can be generous and say that if China were still a very poor developing country, it wouldn't have all the problems it has today. That a lot of the problems it has are because it managed to claw its way to middle income status, which not all countries do. There's tons of countries in the world, I dare say maybe even the majority, sadly, if we just go by the sheer number of nations that have sovereign status, that haven't made it nearly as far as China has, $12,000 or $13,000 per capita today, and certainly didn't do so as quickly as China has. But that was true already in 2013. In 2013, as you noted, Xi Jinping took the pen in his own hand and rang the bell and said, we need to address big changes in our economic system. We need to make the market decisive. We need to pull the state away from industries where it has no business being. We need to deal with center local fiscal reform. We need to do a whole lot of things. And those were acute problems that he and his team acknowledged in 2013. None of them have been resolved. And while the plenum document that just came out claimed that all of the tasks set out in the 2013 plenum had been finished and taken care of, it then went on and listed all the same problems as requiring the party's leadership to solve going forward. And so the coherence and sort of quality of the 17,700 word document released on Sunday, really has to be talked about here. There's something is amiss, right? If this many words can be spelt without, offering a reasonable acknowledgement of the nature of the problem, which is that for at least 11 years, the Xi regime has been working on dealing with these basic economic challenges that they're not the first to have to deal with. Any country that's become rich has had to go through this territory, right? So there's a lot to be learned from others. There's a lot that can be we can understand how it needs to be fixed. But if we don't diagnose it, we can't really move on to deal with it. And that's the headline, if we're being honest about where we are right now.
Yeah, and we're not sitting inside China, so we can be honest about what's actually going on there, which I know is sometimes a problem when you're trying to
It
ascertain
is,
exactly what the state of the economy is.
yeah. I mean, if there are a significant number of Chinese economists who are, you know, nominally private at non-government entities, and some of them at government think tanks as well, who in Chinese WeChat groups and things that can be, found online, are actually acknowledging and talking about the same problems I'm talking about, maybe in slightly more, anodyne or sort of masked terms, but not hard for anybody with macroeconomic training to see what they're talking about. And so, yes, we can be much franker, and I can even be snarky about it. You wouldn't want to try that in Beijing today. Um, However, economics at the end of the day is something that is trying to be a science, and it's based on a couple hundred years of experimentation with market mechanisms. We've learned a lot, And Chinese economists are not sort of missing that textbook on their shelf. They too understand that there is a heavy price to be paid if you set prices based on political whims rather than on what markets say people are willing to pay for things. And that's unfortunately what Beijing is trying to do now, find a way to have political control over everything without the loss of efficiency that everyone else has discovered is the consequence of doing that.
And so they're not maybe listening to the traditional economic advice on this, right? So there's a lot of stakeholders that they're trying to manage within their domestic political system. That looks different than how it would look in the US, right? She's not up for election. They don't have that same sort of democratic process for accountability, but they still have to manage those internal dynamics, right? You've got citizens who, they want to have improved living standards. They've got the security apparatus. They've got foreign investors. What are the main constituencies that you think she and his close circle are worried about as they're trying to work their way through, kind of muddle through some of these economic difficulties?
Oh, that's a great question. And I don't think I've tried to answer it before. So let's see how well I do. But first and foremost, um, we've got about, call it like 400 million or 500 or 550 million urban Chinese citizens who are the ones responsible for pushing up per capita income levels and most of the productivity of the country over the past, you know, 50 years, including today. Um, and I mentioned the property sector, seriousness of the property sector um, crisis, pick your term, over the past 3 years. Maybe 80% of the life savings of urban Chinese is in their property portfolio, the one they live in, and one or two empty apartments they bought as an investment property because they were scared to put their money in the stock market and they're not allowed to put it in investments overseas, right? So all they really had was more property to put their life savings in, right? And the official series on what's happened to property values over the past 3 years, not entirely reliable, but most of the sort of reliable proxies, independent proxies for property values, show anything from a 15 to a 30 or even 40% decline in the net present value of Chinese property versus the peak that we saw in 2020, 2021. And so on paper, urban Chinese have really, really taken a terrible haircut. I have no doubt that Xi Jinping and everyone in the party leadership is immensely concerned with the sentiment and uh, mood of the general urban middle class population of the country. Right? They're the ones who, in turn, have to make a million little decisions a day that add up to either dynamism or malaise in the economy. They do that by deciding whether to invest more money in their businesses if they're private business owners, or to hire somebody and give them a job, or to offer somebody a raise. If they're running the household budget rather than looking at this as somebody in business, they're deciding whether they can afford to have more meat on the table this week, or whether now's a good time to take a vacation or buy another electric vehicle, or all those kinds of things. And so, number one, though uh, General Secretary Xi does not want to, suggest that he is constrained by the sentiment of the people. He absolutely is, and has to be terribly concerned about that. Um, there, whereas in some more sort of market-driven economies, the advice you'd get from your Fed would be you can't have the federal government step in and try to stop a correction in the markets. That'll just make it worse. You have to let things find their bottom. Beijing is not doing that. Every time the markets try to correct, they step in and try to shore things up. Just this past Monday, they cut overnight market interest rates just a little bit in an attempt to inject you know, a little caffeine into the economy's circulatory system, shall we say. So that's a crucial constituency. Obviously, the military and the security community is a crucial constituency. I think you guys know, Geoff and Emily, more about that than I do. But just as an economist, looking at the amount of energy that she and the leadership spend speaking to shoring up, strengthening, ensuring no corruption in the military and security structure, that's obviously a big concern. And then I'll mention two more, and then I'll stop so we can move on. But for just as I said before, for the United States to have economic security, it has to have economic efficiency and dynamism. That same observation put through Xi Jinping's lens right now is that China needs to have innovation, right? And technological advancement. It was, in fact, Deng Xiaoping's great insight throughout the 50s and 60s, and then finally, when he got a chance to put it to work in the 70s, that China was falling behind technologically, and that if it didn't close that gap, it was never going to be a serious country in the international context. Xi Jinping once said that China had missed the first industrial revolution and it mustn't miss the next one. In fact, he may have said they missed the first and the second. If the second was semiconductors, they certainly weren't there from the 50s through the 90s when semiconductors turned the world as we knew it upside down. So what's the new revolution, right? AI, is it? We can talk about that, but clearly he pays huge lip service to things, to that constituency, the innovators, the high technology companies. But it's complicated. By and large, they're not state-owned enterprises. They tend to be private firms that were that innovative. Um, in recent years, the state has tried to take a quote unquote golden share in all of them so that it has a new lever of influence over them. But is that really accretive to their innovativeness and their dynamism? The evidence suggests no, it's not. And so they're like, the more somebody who doesn't understand how market economies works tries to you know tries to help the sector, right, the more damage they are going to do. In this case, it's a he because all the Chinese leaders are he's, which may be part of the problem, but we can talk about that if you like. But anyway, so they clearly see the tech sector as a crucial constituency that the future power and throw weight of the country, both in soft power terms and hard power terms, is dependent on. And yet everything they do to try to help it seems to be hindering and hurting it. A subset of that, by the way, is foreign invested companies in China that, while they certainly aren't doing a very good job of, making that community happy lately, there's a little window dressing, always offered to provide some encouragement there as well.
Great, wonderful. Thanks, Dan. So that's a really great job of sort of explaining what's at stake here, kind of who are the different constituencies Xi Jinping and his allies are managing. It seems like lots of sort of high expectations going into this meeting. So maybe, it'd be great to get more of your takeaways from what were the outcomes. You mentioned there's a sort of 17,000 word document. What's really inside that? Spare our listeners from having to read all 17,000 words. What do you think were the kind of key takeaways? In particular, is there anything that surprised you that came out of the meeting?
No, I'm sorry, Jeffrey. Everybody's going to have to read it. No, just kidding. Let's see. Well, let me. I'll take an abstracted swing at that, and then we can circle back and get more specific if you like. My colleagues and I had three things we were looking for at home in our, to decide whether we thought this was going to move the needle on people's expectations about the outlook, right? And the stakes here, right, are that expectations about the quality and quantity of Chinese growth, China's ability to reach its own potential growth, whatever that is, whatever the new ceiling is, are they going to get to that ceiling, right? That is up for grabs, and that depends on the quality of policymaking. And so when we're looking in advance at this plenum document, we're looking for three things. First, a credible diagnosis of what is getting in the way of growth? What's the problem? What's the nature of the headwinds here? Number one. Number two, how concrete are the policies offered up to address those problems, whatever they are, as opposed to just, you know, aspirational statements without specific policy, things to be implemented. And third, how coherent is the policy package? With those three things in mind, number one, as I said before, the document says that all of the problems identified in 2013 were solved by the party by 2019, as it happens, they said. And so right there at the beginning, we've got a problem about the diagnosis. Are they really acknowledging that there's too much statism in the mix here? Absolutely, they are not, right? They're saying what we need here is more party guidance for the system to avoid all that messiness of liberal democracies and these other kinds of systems out there, right? They've got one eye on us and distinguishing their approach, right? At the same time, they're talking about what they're going to do. So, number one, is there a clear diagnosis? There is not a clear diagnosis in this document. Number two, well, if number one is not there, it's pretty hard to have a good set of concrete things. But even if you're not going to, uh, 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 frankly diagnose the problems, you could still lay out a pretty concrete set of to-dos. I personally gave Xi Jinping huge credit for the 2013 version of this document at the beginning of his era. It had laudable concreteness and specificity in it in terms of what was going to need to be done. And it wasn't just talk. They proceeded to try to implement that for about 3 years before they threw in the towel on it. We can talk about that if you like. So this time around, 17,700 characters, right? Each one a word in Chinese. And I tell you, there is precious little concrete, specific policies, lists of things to do, and an extraordinary, right, range of aspirational statements. We will improve the expectations management mechanism. I don't know if you have one of those, guys. I don't have one of those. I'm not sure what it is. Um, Refine the modern corporate system. I mean, who could do
Is,
that?
is
That's
that
like a
not clear
hundred.
to you? That's
Yeah.
totally clear to
I don't
me.
know how to. I don't know how to
Maybe
do
the problem is
that.
you, Dan.
I think it's me. I don't know how to do these things. They're gargantuan. They're aspirational, and there's 17,000 plus words of this stuff. And so that gets me to my third criteria, cohesiveness, right, and coherence in everything that's in here. If you got like nearly 18,000 words of stuff, it's pretty difficult to keep it all like aligned in the same direction. And sure enough, the admixture of send in the party and the market is going to do this for us on a leash is really, really hard for me to make sense of. I mean, self-evident to me because I look at this stuff too closely, probably that these things are incompatible, right? That you can't have. There's a great metaphor in Chinese. The word for contradiction is maodun, which is a reference to an old story about the unstoppable spear meets the unpenetratable shield. Like, what happens then, right? It's a contradiction, and so we've got this contradiction that the market will do this for us, and the state will tell the market what to do. But again, I think the 20th century, like the rest of the world, learned the hard way that there's some choices that need to be made there. So at a high level, that's what I think about the document where it came out. And I offered a few examples of stuff that I think is a little difficult to put to work there. We can go into more detail if you like. To be a little bit more specific, though, there's 15 chapters and 60 specific deliverable clauses, if you will, that make up this document. And the categories that table of contents of 15 categories is built from, most of them are reasonable things. Like there's one on macroeconomic governance. Well, if that went into sort of a good stock taking of what parts of China's macroeconomy seem to be working well now and which do not, then we'd be getting somewhere. But it's the right heading, but then there's not the right kind of work underneath that heading, I think, to put it to work.
Got it. So it sounds like it's 0 for 3 on diagnosing the problem, providing concrete advice, and having a kind of coherent, cohesive policy agenda to deal with it. So not terribly promising. But let me just follow up on one issue. You mentioned briefly previously that kind of Western multinational companies are also paying attention to this and sort of, are one of the stakeholders at least that Xi Jinping is at least partly responding to. Could you say a little bit about kind of what were these companies looking for out of the third plenum, and are there any silver linings of kind of handout to the Western business community operating in China?
Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, when I say 0 for 3, I mean I look at this through a Western liberal macroeconomic lens, right? And if I were a true believer in China's kind of socialism they're trying to build, I guess you'd look at this and see it differently. Martin Trezimp over at Peterson, for some reason, he sees like a little bit more reason to be hopeful here than I do. So, there may be some other views here. There's a little bit of possibly some progress on fiscal reform at the local level. It all depends on what they mean by the things they said, but it's definitely not like a nice, bright clarion 2013 or 1978, as we noted, right, really made a difference. 1993 and 1998 also made big differences, right? 93 got things back on track after Tiananmen. 1998 started the shutdown of 120,000 state-owned enterprises and the privatization of the entire property sector of the country. So, big things could happen. They're not happening in this, but there might be a little bit of better stuff in there. I might just be a little sour from my Sunday getting blown up by 17,700 characters. But for the multinationals, foreign invested firms, right, that are doing business in China or relying on China for exports that they bring to the rest of the world as well, that matters, let's say. And Rhodium, in addition to all the public policy work we do, we also work with firms. And so I talked to quite a few interesting companies who have qualified points of view about this. By and large, the business community has ceased to take these gargantuan documents seriously. Their expectations were pretty low going into this, and they could only be surprised on the upside. They've already braced themselves for a pretty, disappointing quality of policymaking. They no longer can have a faith-based China business strategy. Already, they've had to speak on investor calls too many quarters and explain, as I think General Motors had to today, why the numbers are not coming in better than they are. And so they're being quite realistic about this stuff. I've spoken to a few firms over the past 48 hours. And as with, I would say, most economists, even with their low expectations, they were a little bit disappointed that there wasn't a bit more protein amongst the carbohydrate in this thing. But by and large, firms are already there. They know what's going on. They understand the seriousness of re-regulating and de-risking. Your podcast name, coming out of Washington. Even in Berlin, where I have 3 people and we spend a lot of time talking to folks in business and government, everyone knows the direction of travel. It's just a question of how long it's taking for Germany to, think differently about its China interests, about what economic security means for Germany in the context of China's divergence from the marketization it had been doing for so long, right? And so, yeah, I think less surprise in the business community than you might think. Was there anything in the document specifically meant for foreign invested firms. There were a handful of sentences in this thing that made mention of the importance of letting the foreign invested sector know how much it's, what an important role it has in China, this kind of thing. But off the top of my head here, I can't think of a single concrete deliverable to be offered to the foreign investor community from the document.
Okay, so lots of good news and optimism coming from Dan Rosen.
I can I can I can try to offer clarity. I'm afraid, that's the best I can do. Yeah.
No, it's what we're here for, Dan. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what this means for the U.S. China economic relationship. I mean, obviously, there's been a huge amount of discussion recently around Chinese overcapacity. There's been for the policy levers of the US government and even the EU, surprisingly swift reactions in terms of like imposing tariffs on strategic goods where they're anticipating this overcapacity from China in EVs and other sorts of technologies and trying to get ahead of it. We can debate whether that's a good idea or not, but clearly, in terms of just the China's relationship with the Western industrialized democracies, there's a lot of tension there, and it seems like, by all indications, everything you just said and what we're reading in the press, China's plans for kind of managing its economic downturn don't appear to be headed in a direction that would alleviate any of that. It seems like we're only headed towards more tension in the trade relationship. I mean, set aside our own US politics, which we'll get to in a second, but just based on how China's managing its economy right now, it doesn't seem like there's good news in terms of lowering the temperature on some of these trade disputes. Is that fair?
Yeah, you're on to something really, really important here, in my opinion. And probably my biggest priority in terms of the message and conversation I've been offering folks in governments over the past 2 years has been that this Chinese overcapacity, which is leading to the surge of exports, which is a big enough wave that it could knock out whole strategic sectors in the rest of the world, as solar panels was knocked out in Europe, right? Just for one example, right? This is not a Chinese design. This is Nobody in Beijing planned this. This is a side effect of their own domestic economy not growing nearly as fast as they expected it to, right? And so if you expected China to come roaring back after COVID, right, and get back to 5-6% GDP growth, if, in other words, the GDP growth numbers that Beijing is reporting were true, then this degree of spillover of production to the world would not be happening. And so, since too many people for too long learned the lesson that you should never bet against Beijing. If Beijing says it's going to have 6% growth, it'll have 6% growth. And then we have the IMF and others validating those numbers and saying, yep, on our checklist, apparently China grew exactly what it said it was going to grow, even though all these problems are happening that nobody expected in employment levels, in property sector, all this kind of stuff. Then you're going to be systematically overestimating China's ability to absorb its own production, right? And you're going to get suddenly, gobsmacked, I think is the technical term in trade, by this wave of Chinese product that China can't absorb. And that's exactly what's happening. The little bit of good news is that while I don't think our strategic community fully absorbed the notion that China could miss its economic targets so badly the past 2 years, I think the economic leadership in DC did get it, and so we're right on the mark. Early this year, Janet Yellen, to name one principal, speaking to overcapacity in near real time, as that problem started to roll out. Likewise, the Europeans on the economic side also got pretty good sense of what was coming down the pike. And so it's not 2 years into the EV, wave that they're talking about trade defense. They had that investigation underway fairly timely, such that they put in place their temporary duties now to try to manage this. Probably not enough. We can talk about what enough looks like. But so this is different, right? We haven't seen this sort of anticipation of a structural economic imbalance problem hitting our shores in a long time. And we're not getting it perfectly right here, but we're doing better, I think. I think folks are starting to get it right. So that's pretty interesting right now. There's still a long way to go because, as we're discussing, there really is. And by the way, there's a CSIS bunch of hot takes, including mine, on the plenum that I think is up as of yesterday. Scott Kennedy put up. Go take a look if you like. The last point that Logan Wright, my partner, and I made in our contribution was nothing in the plenum document will deal with this external problem spillover. So we needed to see an acknowledgement, a diagnosis, I'll use that term again, of the demand problem inside China in order to have some hope of a policy that would address it. We're not seeing that. And so essentially China's doubling down on expecting the rest of the world to absorb its overcapacity.
So what happens when we don't? I mean, right, like the tariffs on some of the products from the US are intended to be not just to like neutralize the effect of overcapacity, but like just to prohibit some of these products from coming into the US market. I mean, I don't think you would otherwise see 100% tariffs on EVs or batteries or whatever it was. So what happens when China is actually shut out of some of these markets and it still has this overcapacity? Does it all flood into third-party markets? Does our economy collapse? Like, how do you play that one out?
Good one. Good question. We don't know, right? Because this is the world's second largest economy. It's an $18 trillion economy. And some of the things it's making in superabundance, like electric batteries, the United States can't make. And
Right.
so if that stuff floods into third markets, is it not going to find its way into US consumption anyway? One of the candidates for presidency of the United States for the national election this November just surprised folks by saying he thinks Chinese automotive and battery makers should be investing directly in the United States because we want that money coming here, not Mexico. He actually said that for the first time back in February, and few people noticed. He said it again with verve this time, and folks are definitely noticing. That's really interesting. And so if there were a hermetic seal around China and it really had no ability to, even get like 50% to exporting its way out of this problem, then I think that would force them to make really big reform choices at home very quickly. They'd have no choice but to basically do a big bang of reform. I don't think anybody expects that to happen. So the question is, will the partial sort of quarantining ourselves off from Chinese overcapacity be enough to change the reaction function in Beijing and get them to be a little bit more reform minded? There's also the possibility that they propose a managed trade solution. So back in the good old days, the liberal economic mavens decried the evils of managed trade, which is when governments step in and offer some sort of negotiated off ramp to full on, yanking of permanent normal trade relations and something like that. I noticed just today in some Chinese language transcripts of public, but not broadly, offered broadcast Chinese economist conversation, Chinese economists starting to talk about how important it is that Beijing offer the West voluntary export restraints, VERs, which is what we extracted from Tokyo in the 80s and 90s in order to stay our hand for having a complete trade war with Japan at the time. That would mean that rather than us blocking Chinese vehicles at our border, they put a quota on what BYD can export to the United States, and they collect the tariff rent essentially from keeping the numbers limited on the outbound side. So that's interesting that there's already like quasi-official, not really official, but some discussion of that inside Beijing. And I have a feeling that given, former President Trump and Bob Lighthizer predilection for managed trade, we know that from the Phase 1 agreement, it was just the whole thing was a managed trade framework. I wouldn't be surprised to see more discussion about this in the time to come.
Great. So maybe following up a little bit on this sort of idea of managed trade and kind of where we're going with the election. Also wanted to get, maybe your quick take on Trump floated the idea of sort of 60% across the board tariffs on China. Do you think, I guess, is that reasonable kind of policy to happen? What would be the effect in China? And then what do you think kind of China's retaliation to that move might be?
Well, from coming back to, my not definition, but my kind of attempt to grapple with economic security, right? I would have a big problem with that because it's indiscriminate and it has no theory of impact on it. Like, why put 60% on everything if there's stuff that China makes that we don't make and it's not strategic? Why not take it without any tariff, save ourselves the inflation pressure, and use the money we save to invest in building semiconductors or something like that, right? So, putting trade protection in place always has a cost to our economic dynamism, and putting trade protection on everything has a big cost on our economic dynamism. And we're going to need a lot of economic dynamism to pay our bills, right? We've got debts to pay, we've got investments to make. I'm sure you guys have some, a wish list of things you'd like to see more U.S. strategic investment in additional sectors, in addition to CHIPS Act and IRA catch-up investment that we're making here. We're going to need to resource all that. And tariffs that are just a big round number that have no strategic purpose, I find that a little too extravagant for the times. Now, perhaps the point of that 60% number is that it's simple to understand. Thus, it has a lot of signaling effect that maybe he thinks it confers leverage and that nobody can miss, what it means or something like that, and that he'll never have to do it if he just puts a big enough number, down in the first instance. I don't know. I'm just an economist, and now we're in the realm of political economy or politics or geopolitics, or I don't know. So you guys have to tell me whether that sounds like a good idea to you. But as an economist and a business owner who employs people and has to pay their healthcare bills, I don't see the use in putting tariffs on, pharmaceuticals and antibiotics that America needs China to produce for it.
Great. And then maybe one more kind of political campaign idea, good to kind of bounce off you here. We've heard the Trump campaign talk a little bit about concerns over exchange rates and currency, in particular the view that, the US dollar is overvalued. In particular, I think there's sort of, longstanding concerns in the US about sort of, is the Chinese currency undervalued? So, we were talking about voluntary export restrictions a moment ago. Is there another opportunity to kind of go back to the 1980s Japan playbook and do a new Plaza Accord that would kind of, focus on readjusting exchange rates and kind of decreasing the value of the US dollar? Is that something that you think makes sense for the US to pursue?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And let me say, and I know we're running short on time probably for you guys, but as a preface, it's really important that we are reopening ourselves, right, to all these different possible policy options to grapple with the systemic problem that we have. We have a systemic problem that for 30 years, China, along with everybody else, was no longer debating what kind of economy they should be when they grow up. It should be market oriented because that was more accretive to prosperity, national welfare, ability to alleviate poverty and deal with global problems, right? All this kind of stuff. And now we're no longer convergent. Now we have two different systems here in competition, and so as much as we'd like to be back in a world that I grew up in, you guys started out in professionally, we all did, where, we all had the same ultimate end goal. The question was, how long could we hang in there waiting for it? Now we have to go back and think about a broader playbook. Definitely currencies and China's currency value has been a huge issue. So in other words, I'm giving the Trump one people a lot of credit for some of the reinvigorating the economic policy discussion that started there. It was a good sort of opener. They didn't do a great job of sort of bringing it into the next phase where you actually have to implement and get stuff done. Biden's done a brilliant job of that. I think it's extraordinary how much has been accomplished in the past 3.5 years. Going forward, we are going to have to look at currency. This is a great example of something the U.S. can't do unilaterally, right? An exchange rate is the value of two currencies, and each country gets a say in what to do about that bilateral exchange rate. Can we work within the G7 to have, as we did in Plaza and Louvre with the Japanese in the 80s, a sort of everybody is telling you you will fix the value of your currency? I think that in coming G7 meetings, we will be continuing to talk more and more about that. We probably talked about it a little bit this time, but couldn't quite get there in terms of the currency. Right at this moment, though, I think if China just threw open the door to letting the market determine the value of the renminbi, it would probably go down against the dollar quite seriously because of all those long-term structural macroeconomic problems I mentioned. So careful what you ask for, you might get it. And it might be a much weaker Chinese currency.
As a child of the 80s, I'm really enjoying all of these throwback references, and I'm just hoping we get some like puff sleeves and neon eyeshadow in there as well, just to really round it out. Dan, just let us take it home with just two quick last questions for you that we ask all of our guests. So the first question is, we've been talking about some very technical stuff. Not everyone follows China's domestic economy very closely. Why does all of this matter for most Americans? Why should they care about how China's economy is doing?
Right. Well, let's see. I mean, um, first of all, it's like 20% of humanity, of course, right? This is like a lot of people. We're on the same planet, like it or not. We share the same ecosystem. And there are things that we are going to ultimately have to deal with together, whether we want to or not. Of course, we must never forget that. But also, world's second largest economy, as goes China, so the global economy will go. The United States, in many ways, is more insulated from the worst case scenarios for China's economic outcomes than, say, Southeast Asia is, or Japan and Korea, or even these days, I dare say, Europe. But we're not immune from it, right? A lot of American product, especially for farmers and for Boeing, right? And other things as well, still goes to China. And of course, a lot of stuff that we consume, a lot of stuff that goes into the weekly consumption basket. We're getting ready to go back to school in 6 weeks here. It's hard to believe it's midsummer, but here we go. It's almost time to go back to school. The price of getting your kids ready to go back to school without what is presently on the shelves at Walmart from around the world, and it's not just China, right? I mean, the talk about trade closure with China, because there's so much Chinese intermediate product and stuff made in other countries too around the world, right? Canada, Mexico, Europe, Vietnam, etc., right? It's going to really take a huge bite out of our paychecks to gratuitously and excessively decouple from China. So it feels good to think about doing that. I don't need them. I'll just do it myself. But man, it's gonna be very painful when we look at what's in the icebox. Excuse me, the refrigerator. I still say icebox. We'll talk about that someday. But anyway, that's the 1880s, not the 1980s. Anyway, so yeah. So those are a few things to think about.
Great, thanks. And maybe one final question we like to ask all of our guests. Do you have any recommendations of something smart you've read or listened to on economic security, on China's economy recently? Either a book, an article, a podcast, anything like that.
It's hard to keep up with the literature. It's growing so fast. There's so much good and fertile creative thinking coming out there. You guys have a lot to do with that. Some of the things that I have taped to my wall here next to my monitor, several of them are the reflections on the makings of an efficient American industrial policy that Dalip Singh offered us during his interregnum between terms at the White House, right? And I mean, he's, on the one hand, reminding us that we can do this, that we always have, and that we must, and it's crucial that government does play a huge role in a lot of ways, but also that it's crucial we do it in a way that other market democracies can also benefit from, engage with, do in a collective way. Just for example, there's other lessons learned that he did a dynamite job, I think, of distilling into some of his short, accessible essays on the topic. And those are the first to come to mind.
So we did actually get a note of optimism out of you, Dan. That's a good note to end on. Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining us. And for all of our listeners, highly recommend checking out the Rhodium Group's published research on China's economy. Dan, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks guys very much. My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to De-Risky Business, an economic security podcast from the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Have any questions or comments? Get in touch at deriskybusiness@cnas.org. The nerdier, the better. And find us wherever you get your podcasts every other Thursday.